Deep in the mountains of North Carolina, a man who has lived completely off the land for more than 40 years now faces the biggest threat of his entire life. Government agencies have turned their attention toward Turtle Island, and what happens next could decide whether real, traditional American independence can still exist in today's world, or whether it finally disappears. The warning signs. The official certified letter arrived on a freezing January morning in 2024. Its state seal sliced through the peaceful quiet of Turtle Island like a chainsaw cutting through untouched timber. Eustace Conway stood on the porch of the hand-built cabin he had constructed himself, the same rough-hewn boards he had milled from trees right there on the mountain. His weathered, scarred hands, marked by decades of primitive living, shook slightly as he ripped open the envelope. Not from fear, but from something far deeper: anger, betrayal, and the sudden realization that the fight he had been waging quietly for years had just reached its breaking point. Inside that envelope was a direct threat to end everything. A formal notice of violation, a list of citations for buildings constructed without permits, strict demands for immediate compliance with current building codes, and requirements that would force Turtle Island to change from a living symbol of American self-reliance into just another inspected, approved, regulated piece of land, no different from any suburban development. The irony hit Eustace hard. Here he was, a man who had devoted his whole adult life to proving that people could thrive using only ancient skills and knowledge handed down through generations, now being told that his entire way of life was against the law. The notices pointed to structures built over the past 20 years, the kitchen building, the blacksmith shop, the cabins where apprentices learned nearly forgotten skills. Even the outdoor privy, built in the classic Appalachian style that mountain families had used successfully for centuries, was flagged as non-compliant. Every single one was marked for potential demolition. The state demanded inspections, certifications, modern plumbing, and electrical systems installed by licensed professionals. They wanted Turtle Island to conform, or face serious consequences. That morning Eustace walked down to the creek, the same creek he had drunk from for 40 years, the same water that had sustained every living thing on his 1,000-acre preserve. He thought about all the young people who had come to Turtle Island over the years, searching for something genuine in an increasingly fake world. Thousands of them, learning how to start fires without matches, build shelters with hand tools, live in balance with nature instead of fighting against it. What would happen to them if Turtle Island was forced to shut down? Where would the next generation learn these skills that once defined what it meant to be free and independent in America? As he knelt by the water, Eustace Conway made up his mind. He would not go quietly. He would not simply comply and watch everything he had created be destroyed or twisted beyond recognition. This fight was about far more than his personal lifestyle. It was about whether Americans still had the right to choose a different way of living, to step outside the system, to prove that modern conveniences were choices, not requirements. The battle for Turtle Island was about to become very real, and its outcome would send waves far beyond these mountains. The legacy built over decades. To understand exactly what is at stake, you have to understand what Turtle Island truly stands for. This is not just a camp or a simple homestead. It is a living proof of what human beings can achieve when they reconnect with skills that kept our species alive for thousands of years. Eustace Conway bought the first piece of land in 1987 using money he had saved from different jobs and projects. Even then he was already well known in primitive living circles, having walked across America on horseback, lived in a teepee through brutal winters, and mastered skills most people had never even heard of. His vision was clear from day one. Turtle Island would be a place where ancient knowledge could be kept alive and passed on to others. A place where people could remember what their great-grandparents once knew without thinking: how to read the forest, how to find food and medicine in the wild, how to build lasting shelters using only materials from the surrounding land, how to forge iron in a traditional blacksmith shop, how to tan leather, weave baskets, make pottery without modern kilns, and perform hundreds of other tasks that today's society has handed over to factories and specialists. over the following decades. Eustace expanded Turtle Island to roughly 1,000 acres of beautiful, untouched Appalachian mountain land. Every structure on that property told its own story. The main cabin, built from trees he harvested right there on site, featured hand-hewn logs notched and fitted together using techniques that dated back to the earliest days of the American frontier. The bark was stripped with draw knives. The wood shaped with broad axes and adzes. Every cut was a quiet meditation on patience and precision. No power tools. No shortcuts. Just one man, his knowledge, and his absolute determination to prove it could still be done. The kitchen building held a huge stone fireplace where all cooking happened over open flames. Eustace and his apprentices baked bread in Dutch ovens buried in coals, smoked meat in a traditional smokehouse, and preserved vegetables using root cellaring and fermentation methods that existed long before refrigerators. The blacksmith shop rang with the steady sound of hammer on anvil as students learned to turn raw iron into tools, hinges, nails, and hardware, everything handmade, everything useful, everything a direct rejection of the throwaway culture that dominates modern life. But Turtle Island was never just about buildings and skills. It grew into a real educational center that drew thousands of visitors every year. School groups came to spend a day stepping back into the past, touching history in ways no textbook could match. Adults arrived for week-long primitive living courses, leaving behind their dependence on technology and rediscovering abilities they never knew they had. Troubled youth found direction and purpose through programs that challenged them physically and mentally while teaching self-reliance and deep respect for nature. Eustace himself became the living example of Turtle Island's entire mission. With his long hair, buckskin clothing, and encyclopedic knowledge of traditional skills, he served as a bridge between past and present. He could explain the botanical properties of every plant on the mountain, demonstrate fire starting using only friction, track animals through the forest with almost uncanny accuracy, and build practical tools from materials most people would throw away as trash. His ability to live comfortably in conditions that would kill most modern Americans was never a stunt. It was a powerful statement about human adaptability and the real dangers of depending too much on systems we can't control. The success of Turtle Island eventually drew media attention, including Eustace's appearances on the History Channel's Mountain Men series, which introduced him to millions of viewers around the world. People were fascinated by this man who chose, completely voluntarily, to reject modern conveniences in favor of a harder but more authentic existence. Fan mail arrived from every corner of the country, people inspired to reconnect with simpler ways of living. Some sold their homes and moved to rural areas. Others started gardens or learned basic bushcraft skills. The ripple effects were impossible to measure, but they were undeniably real, yet success also brought increased scrutiny. As Turtle Island's profile grew, so did attention from regulatory agencies responsible for enforcing building codes, health rules, and zoning laws written for conventional development. What had worked perfectly using traditional methods suddenly became problematic when viewed through the lens of modern bureaucracy. The stage was quietly being set for a direct clash between two completely different ideas about how people should be allowed to live. When regulations threaten a way of life, the conflict between Eustace Conway and government regulators did not appear suddenly. It built slowly, starting with small complaints and questions that gradually turned into serious legal threats. The first signs came in the early 2000s when neighbors, bothered by increased traffic to Turtle Island's educational programs, filed complaints with the county. Suddenly, a property that had operated peacefully for years was being examined under rules designed for commercial businesses rather than educational homesteads. Building inspectors arrived carrying clipboards and writing citations. They measured structures against codes written for conventional stick-built homes constructed by licensed contractors. They questioned whether buildings met fire safety standards, whether sleeping areas had proper emergency exits, and whether kitchen facilities complied with commercial food service regulations. Each inspection uncovered new violations. Each violation came with demands for changes that would fundamentally alter the entire character of Turtle Island. The most serious danger appeared around 2013 when the county officially declared several buildings in violation of building codes and threatened Eustace with jail time unless he brought everything into full compliance. The ultimatum was clear and uncompromising. Either retrofit every structure to meet modern standards, which would mean tearing down hand-built log buildings and replacing them with conventional construction featuring licensed electrical systems, modern plumbing, and inspected foundations, or face prosecution and possible closure of all educational programs. For Eustace, this was an existential crisis. The whole purpose of Turtle Island was to show that traditional methods actually worked, that people did not need the complex systems modern society insisted were mandatory. Forcing these buildings to comply with codes written for conventional construction would destroy their entire educational value. A log cabin with drywall, circuit breakers, and PVC plumbing would no longer be a genuine example of frontier architecture. It would become a hollow imitation, pretending to be something it was not. The legal fight dragged on for years and demanded huge resources. Eustace hired attorneys who argued that Turtle Island should be exempt from certain regulations because of its educational mission and its use of historical construction methods. They pointed out that similar structures in national parks and living history museums operated without being forced to meet residential building codes. They stressed that adults who came to Turtle Island for educational programs did so voluntarily, fully aware they were experiencing primitive conditions as part of the learning process. The state pushed back hard, arguing that public safety could never be compromised, no matter the educational purpose. They claimed that any building housing overnight guests, even temporarily for education, must meet minimum standards for fire safety and structural integrity. They raised concerns about liability. What if someone was injured in a building without proper exits, or if a structure failed because it didn't meet modern engineering requirements? The bureaucratic system moved forward, completely indifferent to arguments about tradition, education, or personal freedom. During this long period, Eustace was forced to make painful compromises. Some structures received minor modifications that met the minimum technical code requirements without completely changing their character. Inspectors were granted access to measure, photograph, and evaluate buildings against checklists that seemed ridiculous when applied to log cabins built with 18th-century techniques. Money that could have gone toward more educational programs instead went to lawyers, permit fees, and required changes that added nothing to actual safety, but satisfied bureaucratic demands. The stress took a visible toll. Eustace, usually full of energy and optimism, grew visibly weary from constant legal battles over permissions and approvals. Time spent defending Turtle Island was time stolen from teaching, from building, from actually living the values the property was meant to represent. Young people who traveled hundreds of miles to learn primitive skills often found themselves caught in the middle of a legal drama that overshadowed the education they had come for. Yet the real issue was never about specific code violations. It was about control, and about the modern state's inability to tolerate any real alternative to its approved way of living. Eustace was not harming anyone. His students were voluntary participants who wanted exactly what he offered. The buildings, though unconventional, had stood safely for decades without incident, but none of that mattered to a regulatory system that saw any deviation from standard norms as a problem that required correction. The battle exposed uncomfortable truths about what American freedom really means today. The same government that celebrates pioneer heritage and frontier independence in history books was actively working to eliminate the last remaining examples of that lifestyle from the modern landscape. You could read about Daniel Boone in school, but you could not live like him on your own land. You could visit historical recreations in theme parks, but you could not create authentic traditional communities without being buried under permits and inspections. As 2024 began, the threats grew stronger again. New violations were cited. Additional structures were flagged for non-compliance. The message was unmistakable: conform completely or face escalating consequences. Eustace stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between abandoning everything Turtle Island stood for or risking its complete destruction through legal action. The battle for self-sufficiency. Eustace Conway's response to the growing regulatory pressure showed exactly how deeply committed he was to the principles Turtle Island represented. Rather than simply fighting a defensive legal battle, he went on the offensive, using the conflict to raise larger questions about American liberty and the right to choose ways of living that differ from the approved norm. His argument was straightforward but powerful: if a man cannot live peacefully on his own land using skills that kept humanity alive for thousands of years, then freedom has become meaningless. He began speaking publicly about the case, giving interviews, appearing at events, explaining the situation to audiences hungry for someone willing to stand up to overreaching bureaucracy. The response was overwhelming. Letters of support poured in from every part of the country. Some came from rural Americans facing similar battles with building inspectors and zoning boards. Others arrived from suburban families who admired Eustace's stand, even though they had no intention of living that way themselves. The common thread was appreciation for someone willing to defend the basic principle that Americans should still have real choices about how to live. Financial support followed the expressions of solidarity. Recognizing that legal fights require serious resources, supporters started fundraising campaigns to help cover attorney fees and court costs. Small donations of $20 or $50 added up into significant amounts. Some people sent larger contributions, seeing the defense of Turtle Island as an investment in keeping options open for future generations. The money allowed Eustace to hire experienced attorneys who specialized in property rights and regulatory challenges. The legal strategy grew to include constitutional arguments about personal liberty and property rights. Attorneys argued that forcing Eustace to abandon traditional construction methods in favor of modern building codes violated his right to use his property peacefully as he chose. They emphasized that Turtle Island posed no threat to neighbors or the wider community: no pollution, no excessive noise beyond natural sounds, no activities affecting anyone except those who voluntarily chose to participate. The regulations being enforced served no genuine public interest, they simply reflected arbitrary preferences for uniformity. At the same time, Eustace strengthened Turtle Island's educational mission. If authorities wanted to shut down primitive living education, he would make sure everyone understood exactly what would be lost. He expanded programming, bringing in more students and documenting traditional skills on video to preserve the knowledge no matter what happened to the physical site. Blacksmithing courses filled months in advance. Primitive fire-making workshops sold out within hours of being announced. People wanted to learn these skills, and Eustace was determined to teach them for as long as he possibly could. Media coverage grew stronger, especially through the Mountain Men television series, which followed his ongoing battles with bureaucracy alongside his daily work maintaining Turtle Island. Viewers watched as Eustace patiently explained to building inspectors why a hand-hewn log cabin did not need drywall, or why a root cellar did not require electrical lighting. The contrast between practical traditional methods and absurd modern requirements was stark and powerful. Support arrived from unexpected places. Academic researchers studying sustainable living and traditional ecological knowledge reached out, offering to document Turtle Island's educational value in peer-reviewed publications. Anthropologists recognized the site as a priceless repository of cultural knowledge that was disappearing rapidly from American society. Environmental scientists pointed out that Eustace's low-impact lifestyle showed practical alternatives to resource-heavy modern construction and living patterns. Other homesteaders and off-grid enthusiasts rallied to the cause, understanding that if authorities could force Turtle Island into compliance, no alternative lifestyle was truly safe. Online forums and social media groups organized letter-writing campaigns directed at county officials and state legislators. The message was consistent: leave Turtle Island alone, stop persecuting a man whose only crime was living differently. Political pressure started building on the agencies pushing enforcement. County commissioners received hundreds of calls and emails asking why resources were being wasted harassing a man who posed no real public threat. Local newspapers published editorials questioning the wisdom of driving away an educational institution that brought positive attention and visitors to the area. Some elected officials, sensing the public mood, began asking whether the enforcement actions actually served any legitimate purpose. The fight also sparked wider conversations about building codes and regulatory overreach. Policy analysts pointed out that many building regulations, while justified in the name of safety, mainly drove up construction costs and limited housing choices, requiring licensed contractors, approved materials, and multiple inspections added tens of thousands of dollars to projects while providing questionable actual safety benefits for simple structures. Eustace's battle became a central example in these larger debates about how much regulation is appropriate, and who should have the power to decide. A community under siege. While Eustace Conway's personal fight made headlines, the threat to Turtle Island affected an entire community of students, apprentices, and supporters who had built their lives around the knowledge and lifestyle the property represented. These individuals faced their own crises as the future of their educational home hung in the balance. Their stories showed the real human cost of regulatory battles that can seem abstract when reduced to legal papers and code violations. Young people who had found direction and purpose at Turtle Island suddenly faced uncertainty about whether the programs that changed their lives would continue to exist. One young man who arrived years earlier as a troubled teenager failing in conventional school had discovered his calling through primitive skills education. He had become a skilled blacksmith, learning to forge tools and hardware using techniques that went back centuries. The possibility of Turtle Island closing meant potentially losing access to the mentorship and facilities that had given him a real career path. His story was repeated dozens of times, each person representing a life improved by what Turtle Island offered. The apprenticeship program, which brought committed students to live and work on the property for extended periods, faced especially difficult disruption. These apprentices, often in their 20s and 30s, had made major life decisions based on the opportunity to immerse themselves fully in traditional skills education. Some had quit jobs, sold possessions, and moved across the country to study at Turtle Island. The regulatory threats created agonizing dilemmas. Should they stay despite the uncertainty? Should they look for other arrangements? Where else could they find comparable education in primitive living and nearly forgotten crafts? Teachers and instructors who worked alongside Eustace also felt the pressure. These were people with rare expertise in traditional skills: hide tanning, natural building, wilderness survival, heritage crafts. They had found at Turtle Island one of the few remaining places in America where their knowledge was truly valued and could be passed to eager students. If the property was forced to close or fundamentally change its operations to meet regulations, these teachers would lose not only their work but a vital platform for preserving knowledge that existed almost nowhere else in modern society. Local community members who had embraced Turtle Island as a unique regional treasure watched with growing concern as government agencies threatened its existence. The property brought visitors to the area, people who spent money at local businesses while attending programs. It offered special educational opportunities for local youth who might never otherwise experience traditional skills. Some locals had attended workshops themselves or sent their children to camps at Turtle Island. The idea of losing this resource to bureaucratic enforcement felt like a betrayal of basic common sense. The wider primitive skills and traditional knowledge community rallied with powerful solidarity. Organizations dedicated to bushcraft, heritage crafts, and sustainable living recognized that an attack on Turtle Island threatened the entire movement to preserve and revive forgotten skills. If the most well-known primitive skills education center in America could be shut down by building code enforcement, then smaller operations faced even greater danger. The fight became about defending the fundamental right of anyone, anywhere, to teach and learn traditional knowledge without being crushed by regulations designed for completely different contexts. Supporters organized gatherings and events to show public backing for Turtle Island. A rally held in 2024 drew hundreds of people to the property, many traveling from distant states. They arrived carrying signs that read, "Preserve traditional freedom," and "Building codes are not one-size-fits-all." Speakers addressed the crowd, sharing personal stories of how Turtle Island had changed their lives and why its survival mattered. The event generated media coverage that increased pressure on officials to reconsider their enforcement actions. The emotional toll on Eustace himself was significant, but he managed it carefully. Those close to him saw moments of frustration and weariness, times when the endless legal battles seemed almost overwhelming, yet in public he maintained remarkable composure and optimism, understanding that his response would shape how others viewed the entire fight. He frequently reminded supporters that the battle was much bigger than himself, that Turtle Island represented ideals worth defending no matter the personal cost. This perspective helped carry him through the darkest moments when victory seemed impossible. Community support went beyond rallies and fundraisers, extending to practical help maintaining Turtle Island operations during the crisis. Volunteers showed up to assist with property upkeep, freeing Eustace to focus more energy on legal matters. Skilled tradespeople offered services at reduced rates or donated labor. Food donations helped offset costs. The outpouring showed that Turtle Island had created a genuine community, networks of people truly invested in its survival and willing to contribute meaningfully to keep it alive. The situation also created divisions, especially with neighbors who had filed the original complaints and with officials required to enforce regulations they might personally disagree with. Some inspectors privately expressed sympathy for Eustace while insisting they had jobs to do and codes to follow. This highlighted the impersonal nature of bureaucracy, how systems can harm individuals even when no single person involved wants that outcome. The machine runs according to its rules, and changing its direction requires far more than appealing to individual conscience. The fight to preserve American freedom as the conflict between Eustace Conway and regulatory authorities stretched into 2025, the battle's importance grew far beyond one man and one property. It became a clear test case, deciding whether traditional ways of living still have any protected space in modern America, or whether the regulatory state now holds total authority to dictate what lifestyles are acceptable. The outcome would send a powerful signal to countless Americans, whether choosing alternative paths was still realistic, or had become effectively illegal. The philosophical stakes were enormous. Eustace presented a clear vision of freedom rooted in self-reliance and minimal dependence on systems outside individual control. This was not anti-government extremism, but a reasonable call for limits on how far regulatory power should reach. His argument struck a deep chord, especially with rural Americans who had watched regulations written for urban and suburban settings get imposed on completely different environments. A septic system rule that made sense in a crowded subdivision became ridiculous when applied to a remote mountain property with a single outhouse serving only a handful of people. Yet bureaucracies treated both situations exactly the same. Legal proceedings exposed the rigid inflexibility of modern regulatory systems. Attorneys for Eustace presented clear evidence. Turtle Island's buildings were structurally sound, traditional construction methods had proven their durability over decades, and no safety incidents had ever occurred despite years of use. None of it mattered under the strict wording of building codes that demanded specific materials, inspections, and procedures. Regardless of whether alternative methods achieved the same real-world results, the system valued procedural compliance over actual outcomes. This revealed a deeper problem with how contemporary America handles risk and safety. Instead of allowing capable adults to make informed decisions about acceptable risk levels, regulations impose uniform standards that eliminate real choice. adults who came to Turtle Island for primitive skills education were fully capable of understanding they would experience rustic conditions. They chose that willingly and knowingly. But the regulatory framework treated them as unable to assess their own risk tolerance, requiring government protection, even when they explicitly rejected it. The economic consequences reached far beyond Turtle Island itself. Forcing compliance with modern building codes for every structure would require investments potentially totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. That money would flow to licensed contractors, inspectors, and suppliers, while destroying real value in the form of traditional buildings that embodied irreplaceable knowledge and craftsmanship. The economic logic favored demolition and replacement over preservation and adaptation, a formula that, if applied broadly, would erase the last remaining examples of traditional American building heritage. Eustace's defense team eventually pursued several strategies at once. Legal challenges continued in court, arguing constitutional protections for property rights and philosophical/religious objections to forced modernization. Political pressure increased through direct advocacy with legislators and officials who could grant exemptions or shift enforcement priorities. Public relations efforts kept media attention focused on the case, making aggressive enforcement politically expensive. Community organizing sustained grassroots support and showed widespread public backing. Some concessions became unavoidable. Certain structures received minor modifications that met technical code requirements without fundamentally changing their character. Fire extinguishers appeared in buildings that had never needed them before. Some paperwork was filed and some permits obtained for future construction. These compromises were strategic retreats, designed to preserve core operations while showing good faith efforts at compliance. The goal was never absolute purity, but survival with core integrity intact. The wider movement for alternative living and traditional skills education watched Turtle Island's fate closely, seeing it as a key indicator of their own futures. If Eustace successfully defended his right to maintain traditional buildings and teach primitive skills, it would set a powerful precedent and encourage others facing similar challenges. If he failed, it would send a chilling message: regulatory authorities could shut down any operation that deviated from approved methods, regardless of educational or cultural value. By late 2025 the situation remained unresolved, but it had evolved from an immediate crisis into a long, drawn-out struggle. Eustace continued operating Turtle Island, teaching students, maintaining the property, and living according to his vision. Enforcement actions had not escalated to actual closure, suggesting officials recognized the serious political difficulties of forcing a popular educational institution to shut down. An uneasy balance emerged, where legal threats remained but were not immediately carried out. This represented a partial victory, but not a final resolution. Eustace understood that defending Turtle Island required constant vigilance. Any relaxation of attention could open the door to renewed enforcement. The broader fight to preserve space for traditional living and alternative lifestyles would continue long after his personal battle ended. Future generations would face their own confrontations with regulatory systems that viewed any deviation from norms as a problem requiring correction. What Eustace had demonstrated, however, was that resistance was possible. One man, armed with clear principles and supported by a real community, could stand against bureaucratic pressure and survive. His example inspired others facing similar challenges to fight rather than comply passively. Turtle Island remained operational, still teaching forgotten skills, still proving that humans could thrive using knowledge modern society had dismissed as obsolete. As long as fires burned in the blacksmith shop and students learned to make friction fire, the spirit of traditional American independence lived on in these North Carolina mountains. The battle for Turtle Island continues. This fight represents all of us who still believe freedom means more than simply choosing between officially approved options. Eustace Conway is not fighting just for his own property, he is fighting for the basic principle that Americans can still choose different paths. If this story moved you, Share it with others who value independence and traditional knowledge. Support those who defend real alternatives to the one-size-fits-all modern world. The future of freedom depends on it.